Yes, thank you, Crystal, for the gracious introduction. Next week will mark the opening of the Aspen Summer Music Festival. And just like every other year, this year's festival is going to prominently feature music by composers who struggled with mental illness. Beethoven, for instance. Beethoven had paranoid persecutory delusions. And then there's Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky was chronically suicidally depressed. And Rachmaninoff dedicated his second piano concerto to his psychiatrist. It's not just composers. According to research by colleagues of mine like Nancy Andreasen and Kay Jamieson, the incidence of psychiatric illness, particularly the mood disorders, it's greater in populations of writers, artists, poets, musicians than in the general population. So what is the impact of mental illness on the creative process? And how does creativity influence the course of mental illness? I want to explore these questions today through an examination of the mind and music of the great 19th century German composer Robert Schumann. Of all the composers in the upcoming Aspen Summer Music Festival, Schumann is the best illustration of the blurred boundary between genius and insanity. It's difficult to do accurate retrospective psychiatric diagnoses on historical figures. I personally have enough trouble getting a diagnosis right with the living, breathing patients I see in my office. But Schumann kept meticulously detailed diaries. He wrote lots of letters, so we have information about his mental state for nearly every day of his adult life. He was born in 1810 into a family with a substantial history of psychiatric illness. Older sister may have had schizophrenia. She killed herself via drowning when Robert was a teenager. His father reportedly had a nervous breakdown the year Robert was born, from which he never fully recovered. His mother had clear, discrete, depressive episodes. Now, music was an important stabilizing force for Schumann in the midst of his chaotic family situation. He was a shy kid. He said the piano was his best companion as a youngster. Age 20, he develops a crippling hand injury, which effectively ends his dream of becoming a concert pianist, and he turns his attention to composing. Within a couple of months of beginning life as a composer, he starts to manifest the pattern of mood swings that's going to dominate the rest of his life. I want to read to you from a letter that he wrote to his piano teacher from around this time. He writes, I feel uncommonly free, light, and in a divine mood. I am so overflowing with sounds that it is impossible to write anything down. If you only knew how pressured I am and driven from within. If I had written everything down, I would by now have already gotten to Opus 100 in my symphonies. So thoughts and ideas are racing so quickly through Schumann's imagination that if he could just write them all down, he would have completed 100 symphonies. He is in the midst of a manic episode. And in addition to the racing thoughts, the flight of ideas, the elevated mood that he alludes to in this letter, when Schumann was manic, he would manifest pressured speech. That's the urgency to speak rapidly. He was typically rather reserved, but during these manic periods, he became much more gregarious. His speech was full of joking and punning. He would spend money he didn't have, which furthered his popularity during these manic periods. Barely needed to sleep. He'd get by in a couple of hours of sleep a night. And when he was manic, he composed prolifically. Now, the manic periods would last days, weeks, sometimes months, but they would always end. They'd either be followed by a period of normal mood, or sometimes he would crash. He'd fall suddenly into a deep depression. When Schumann was depressed, it was difficult for him to concentrate, so he did almost no composing when he was depressed. During these depressive periods, he tended to have auditory hallucinations, and he was vulnerable also to suicidal thoughts, and the delusional conviction that he was a worthless composer. A core belief of Schumann's was that the only reason to write music is to reveal the composer's inner state of mind. Now, contemporaries of his were composing music in established formats. Schumann largely had disdain for form. He was writing pieces with titles like Rapture, Feverish Dreams, First Sorrow. He just wanted to capture feeling states in his music. He was entirely self-taught as a composer, so it's hard to point to anybody who was a predecessor for his style. And there's nobody whom today we consider to be in the pantheon of the great composers that was less appreciated during his lifetime. All right, so Schumann suffered from mood swings, what nowadays we call manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder. There was no language for that in the 19th century. He lost huge chunks of potentially productive creative time because when he was depressed, it was difficult for him to concentrate, so he did almost no composing. But balanced against this disadvantage were undeniable creative advantages. Bipolar disorder is a disorder that magnifies common, everyday human experience into larger-than-life proportions. I mean, we all feel happy or sad at times. The bipolar individual is going to feel anguish, ecstasy, intense rage, unrestrained sensuality. Composers can draw on this intensity for inspiration. Now, there are aspects of the hypomanic state that are conducive to creative achievement. Sharpened imagination, increased energy, decreased need for sleep. This is part of the reason that psychiatrists often find that their bipolar patients are reluctant to comply with treatment recommendations because many of these patients do not want to give up the creative highs that they associate with their mania. Now, a crucial characteristic of mania is the racing thoughts. And in some bipolar individuals, the rapidity of thought is associated with an increased flexibility of thinking that facilitates innovative solutions to creative problems. Finally, there's something about the contrast between the manic state and the depressive state which provides a rich variety of experiences as a source of creative inspiration. Schumann didn't compose much when he was depressed, but he remembered the anguish of his depressed periods because emotional pain is expressed throughout his music. Schumann, aged 25, composes what many now consider to be his first mature masterpiece. It's a piece called Carnival. I'm convinced that this piece could not have been written by somebody who did not have bipolar disorder. It doesn't mean that you have to be mentally ill to write a musical masterpiece, but Carnival stands as practically a catalog of bipolar symptoms. First of all, the piece is based on a pun, and punning is a manic characteristic. When Schumann composed Carnival, he was engaged to a woman named Ernestine. Ernestine came from a town called Asch. Asch is spelled A-S-C-H. And Schumann noticed that the letters in Asch were also letters in the name Schumann. They were the only 4 letters in his name that corresponded to musical notes. This is A here. S in German is ES or E flat, so this is S. This is C, and this is H. H is the German counterpart to B, so this is H. So Schumann played around with these letters, A, S, C, H, A, S, C, H, and he came up with... He said, all right, that's one thing I could do with ASCH. And he thought to himself, well, what else? ASCH, ASCH. And he came up with... And he continued experimenting. A-S-C-H-A-S-C-H. He wound up writing a series of 21 short pieces based on this combination of letters, based on these tonal analogs. This is not how other people were composing music at this time. It was a very manic thing to do. His contemporaries thought the piece was incomprehensible. He didn't care. He thought it was a valid way of expressing himself. Now, these 21 pieces represent an astonishing range of moods. I mean, exuberant, wistful, confessional, capricious. Two of the mood pieces are titled Eusebius and Florestan. When Schumann was 20, he invented two imaginary companions to comfort him during times of stress, and he called them Eusebius and Florestan. Eusebius, a melancholic, poetic dreamer, whereas Florestan was an impetuous, aggressive, frenetic individual. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to suggest that Eusebius represented Schumann's depressive self, and Florestan represented Schumann's manic self. Now, the presence of imaginary companions, common amongst children. When an adult conjures up imaginary companions, it's either a sign of a very active imagination or a warning sign that psychosis is imminent. In Schumann's case, it was a sign of both. Let's listen. This is the poetic, introverted Eusebius. Florestan, by contrast, the manic Florestan. Something remarkable happens here. When Schumann was 21, he composed a piece called Papillon. Now, Papillon contains this theme. In the midst of the manic, frenetic Florestan, Schumann has a memory of a piece that he composed 4 years earlier. Abruptly, without any warning or preparation for the listener, Schumann inserts this memory. Just as abruptly, he exits it and launches back into the frenetic Florestan. Listen. I think these abrupt transitions are part of the reason that Schumann's music was slow to be appreciated by his contemporaries. But remember, he thought the only reason to even write music is to reveal the composer's inner state of mind. And what he's revealing here in Florestan is that when he was manic, his thought process was fragmented. His associations could be loose and illogical. So memories could flit in from almost anywhere or any time. Remember when Schumann wrote that thoughts and ideas were racing so quickly through his imagination that if he could just have gotten them all down, he would have completed 100 symphonies? You get the feeling that while he's composing Carnival, thoughts and ideas are racing quickly through his imagination. He can't get them all down, but he's trying. That is the musical equivalent of pressured speech. I want to play Carnival for you. I don't have time to play all of it, but I'll play enough to give you a sense of the turbulent and chaotic, but truly glorious world of Schumann's imagination. I want to read to you some of what was said about or written about Carnival shortly after it was composed. This is by H.F. Chorley of the Musical World of London, who writes, "An affectation of originality, a superficial knowledge of art, the absence of true expression, and an infelicitous disdain of form has characterized every work of Robert Schumann. Forced and unnatural turn of cadence and progression declare neither more nor less than the convulsive efforts of one who has never properly studied his art to hide the deficiencies of early education under a mist of pompous swagger. We can see nothing of the carnival in these carnival pieces, which are as insignificant in scale as in a child's lesson, uncouth, faded, and wanting in clearness." And then it gets worse, so I think I'll stop. This is from Le Ménestrel of Paris, an influential French music journal. "The music of Schumann lacks clarity. The disorder and confusion invade even his best pages, as, alas, they invaded his brain." Now, this would be neither the first nor the last time that a great piece of music was not immediately appreciated as such. The imaginative leaps of the truly creative mind often requires years before they can be understood and enjoyed. Now, while Schumann was composing Carnival, he was falling in love with the teenage daughter of his piano teacher, a young woman, brilliant pianist, virtuoso, named Clara Wieck. He broke his engagement to Ernestine. He started pursuing Clara. The couple fell in love. They made plans to marry. But Clara's father was adamantly opposed to the relationship. He did everything he could to thwart their intentions to marry. There was a bitter, bitter court battle in which Mr. Wieck made 3 points against the marriage. He said, first of all, he said Schumann would never be able to earn a living and support a family. Second point was that Schumann was mentally ill. He was prone to depression, alcoholism, and dysfunction. And his third point was that Schumann was a mediocrity as a composer, and therefore unworthy of marrying a young woman whom he predicted would one day be the world's greatest pianist. Now, the judge ruled in Schumann's favor, gave the couple permission to marry. Schumann was ecstatic, and a prolonged manic period ensued. During Schumann's newlywed year, he wrote the staggering total of 138 songs. Many of them were love songs. You know, for Schumann, there was always a danger that feelings of ecstasy could spin out of control and degenerate into a manic psychosis. So his channeling of this excess energy into the creation of love songs was highly adaptive. You know, Robert and Clara Schumann forged one of the great creative partnerships in the history of Western classical music. She had a spectacular career as a pianist. She was considerably more famous than he was. They had 8 children together, and the next generation was affected by mental illness. One of their sons was a morphine addict. Another lived his entire adult life in an insane asylum. Now, Schumann's pattern of mood swings continued after the marriage. It's January 1842. He's 31 years old. He falls into a deep depression with disorganized and delusional thinking. And he starts working on fugue and counterpoint exercises. Now, counterpoint is a form of musical writing which relies on a detailed and logical set of rules. And Schumann had previously expressed disdain for formal rules of music, but he discovered that concentrating on a complex set of rules could help organize him and orient him toward the rational world. And by June of that year, his depression subsided, turns his attention to writing a string quartet. Over the next few weeks, he barely pauses to sleep. He, in 18 days, completes 3 string quartets. I mean, this is just phenomenal productivity. And he finishes them. He takes the manuscript scores over to Clara, the obviously very fertile Clara, and he informs her that he had just given birth to triplets. Now, he plunged into a deep depression after he finished those string quartets, and that became a pattern for him. He'd write a major work, fall apart afterwards. There's just this sense that the act of composing was providing Schumann with some temporary inner harmony and kind of warding off the worst manifestations of his mental illness. Okay, February 1854, he's 43 years old. He's experiencing an increase in the frequency, severity, and duration of his auditory hallucinations. He's having trouble organizing his mind creatively, and he lapses into a psychotic delirium. I want to quote you from Clara's diaries from around this time. She writes, "My poor Robert is suffering terribly. He told me about an unusual phenomenon he's noticed for the past several days. In his head, he hears beautiful, perfectly realized musical compositions. They sound to him like distant woodwinds and are notable for the lovely harmonies. He commented that this is how it must be in another life, when we have cast off our mortal frame. Strangely enough, he has not composed for the last 9 weeks. Last night, he was firmly convinced that angels were hovering over him and disclosing the most wonderful revelations, all expressed in glorious music. They extended us their welcome, and we would both be joined with them before the year was past. Morning came, and with it a dreadful change. The angels' voices had turned into the voices of demons with horrible music. They told him he was a sinner and that they planned to cast him into hell. In short, his condition increased literally to one of nervous convulsions. He shrieked in pain. I'll never forget this moment. I was suffering the very agonies of torture with him. He simply could not be talked out of the thought that supernatural and infernal figures were floating about him. It only made him more agitated when I tried to persuade him otherwise. I could not for a moment shake his belief in the demons." Now, the tune that the angels revealed to Schumann, Clara discovered that Schumann jotted this tune down on a piece of paper. For years, she guarded that manuscript almost as if it were a sacred relic. It's worth listening to because it's the last piece of music Schumann ever composed. After 2 weeks of an agitated, unremitting psychotic delirium, Schumann left his home unnoticed one afternoon, walked across the bridge spanning the Rhine River, jumped into the water below. He was rescued by a group of fishermen who brought him back into their boat against his strenuous objections. Not long afterwards, he was brought to an insane asylum where he lived out the rest of his life. Conditions were nightmarish in the insane asylums of the 19th century. The prevailing belief was that the mentally ill needed to be segregated from society, that mental illness represented a divine punishment for some unspeakable moral transgression. Schumann deteriorated dramatically during his hospitalization. He became floridly paranoid. He was convinced the staff was trying to poison him. He lost a lot of his cognitive capacity. His speech eventually became unintelligible. It's been speculated that Schumann at this stage was suffering from neurosyphilis, superimposed on his bipolar disorder, that he had untreated syphilis, which ultimately affected his central nervous system. Schumann died age 46 in the insane asylum, apparently of self-starvation. Now, we have a better understanding of mental illness today than we did during Schumann's time, and we have far better treatment options. But even in our more enlightened times, there's still a considerable amount of stigma that's attached to mental illness. And this stigma reduces access to potentially effective treatments. Part of the reason that I do presentations on mentally ill composers like Schumann is my belief that these presentations, these programs can be helpful in the destigmatization process, because it seems to me perverse to stigmatize a group that includes members who've made such extraordinary contributions to civilization. Now, Clara Schumann outlived Robert by 40 years. She devoted the final 4 decades of her life to honoring the memory of her departed husband. She wore black for the rest of her days. I mean, she went around the world ceaselessly, tirelessly, performing the music of Robert Schumann until the world accepted that Schumann deserved a place in the pantheon of the great composers. Now, I'm going to finish up today by playing for you a piano arrangement of a song that Schumann wrote as a wedding present to his beloved Clara. The song is called Widmung, which means dedication. It's Schumann's portrait in sound of conjugal bliss.